The Netherlands is going through turbulent times.
I signed for the strictest asylum policy, not for the downfall of the Netherlands.
The country of tulips, bicycles, and liberal values. For decades, it was considered a model of openness, but today the situation is starting to seriously deteriorate. In the last 5 years alone, the government has already collapsed 3 times, each time for a variety of reasons, but lately everything revolves around a single issue: migration. It is this that ignites public debate, breaks coalitions, and divides society. Just a few months ago, Geert Wilders was celebrating a victory. He got the most votes in the election by promising stricter laws, tough decisions, and a return to control. But his support is starting to wane a bit, and the government has fallen yet again. The origins of the crisis go back to 2023, when the government of Migr4tion collapsed. It was his 4th cabinet and 4th resignation. The reason was particularly serious. It was about a controversial proposal to limit refugee family reunification. Conservatives wanted to tighten the regulations, including a 2-year waiting period to bring in children. But centrist parties like D66 and the Christian Union saw this as inhumane. As a result, the government fell and early elections were scheduled. The November 2023 vote brought a political earthquake.
I'm in politics for 25 years now, and this is the happiest day of my life so far in politics. We became the #1 party by far. I mean, it's what a lot of people, if you would have asked them a year ago, would call you mad, and it happened today. So I'm very proud.
Geert Wilders, leader of the far-right Party for Freedom, secured 37 seats and nearly 25% of the vote. For years, it was believed that Wilders had no chance of wielding real power. And yet, the people had had enough. Enough of chaos, of endless compromises, and of unchecked migration. But victory didn't yet mean power. To form a government, Wilders had to find coalition partners and make concessions. He ultimately agreed not to become prime minister. The person who emerged for this role was Dick Schoof. The coalition was formed by 4 parties: PVV, the center-right VVD, the agrarian BBB, and the Christian Democratic. And while on paper that gave them a solid majority, in practice, it was a volatile mix. Still, Wilders wasted no time. And by May 2025, he had already presented his 10-point plan. Military troop deployments at the borders, a total rejection of new asylum claims, withdrawal from the EU Migration Pact, and stricter residency rules for existing migrants. For him, it was the fulfillment of election promises. For his coalition partners, it was political suicide. Parties like VVD and NSC, despite being conservative, feared accusations of racism and a revolt from moderate voters. Wilders laid it out plainly. Either his plan passes or he walks out of government, and he kept his word. On June 3, 2025, the government fell. PVV withdrew from the coalition, and Prime Minister Schoof resigned. The Netherlands, once again, plunged into political chaos.
I also just informed the Prime Minister that I will withdraw the PVV ministers from the cabinet and that we can no longer bear responsibility for this. I signed for the strictest asylum policy, not for the downfall of the Netherlands. And our responsibility for this cabinet therefore ends at this moment.
This marks the 2nd time in 2 years that a government has collapsed over migration, and the 3rd time in 5 years that the issue has upended the political scene. New elections have been scheduled for October 29, 2025. But more importantly, this is not just a story about the Netherlands. Because if even such a wealthy and orderly country can't agree on migration, what hope does the rest of the continent have? In 2022, the Netherlands saw a record influx of 403,000 new arrivals. For a country of just over 17 million people, that's a population increase of more than 2% in just 1 year. This sudden surge hit the Dutch housing market hard. Official data show a shortfall of 390,000 housing units. For young Dutch people, this means adulthood on credit, or living with their parents into their 30s. But the problem isn't just about housing, it's also about safety. According to CBS data, already in 2021, 8% of young men of Moroccan descent had police encounters. Among asylum seekers from Algeria and Tunisia, over 40% had recorded criminal incidents. These are no longer dry statistics, they're real stories affecting residents' daily lives. All this is turning migration from a political issue into a societal flashpoint. And the government that was supposed to restore order is itself falling into crisis. That breeds social frustration. The media show images of new housing for migrants, while locals wait years for access to public housing. Who is this country actually for? Support for Wilders wasn't a fluke or a passing whim of a frustrated minority. That's exactly why his PVV secured the most votes in its history, winning 37 seats and surpassing the mainstream parties. It was a political shock that stunned the media, elites, and commentators, but not the voters. The Dutch voted the way they did because for years they felt ignored. When they talked about migration, they were called xenophobes. When they asked about wait times for doctors, the housing shortage, or problems in schools, they were met with slogans about inclusivity and European values. And yet, they were simply describing reality.
Islam de ruimte geeft. Als je politiek correct blijft denken en zegt van ho, dat kan niet, want onze rechtsstaat, dat wij met onze politieke correctheid onze rechtsstaat om zeep laten helpen. En dat is mijn stellige overtuiging. Dat als wij niet de islam aanpakken, dat de rechtsstaat verdwijnt. En waarom? Omdat de islam en vrijheid, de islam en democratie niet samen.
Wilder's support was fueled by the provinces, small towns, villages, and areas far from the urban bubble of The Hague or Amsterdam. There, people feel abandoned. Wilders didn't speak in expert jargon, didn't quote reports. He spoke plainly Dutch people first, and that simplicity was his strength. He spoke the people's language. He said the Netherlands must wake up before it's too late. That support was a rebellion against political correctness, elite ignorance, and the marginalization of ordinary citizens. Many people went to the polls for the first time in years, feeling like their vote actually mattered. This social revolt had Wilders' face, but its roots go much deeper. The Netherlands no longer resembles a single country so much as a society more divided than ever before. The symbol of these tensions became Rotterdam, the country's second largest city and one of the most multicultural. Its former mayor, Ahmed Abataleb, a Muslim of Moroccan descent, spoke words that shook the public debate.
Je plek niet kunt vinden met de manier waarop wij met elkaar een samenleving willen bouwen. Want wij willen hier alleen mensen hebben, ook al die moslims, al die goedwillende moslims die nu waarschijnlijk hierop aangekeken worden. Al die mensen willen we graag bij elkaar houden in wat ik noem de wij-samenleving. Ja, en als je het hier niet ziet zitten, omdat je humoristen niet ziet zitten die een krantje maken. Ja, mag ik het zo zeggen, rot toch op.
He directed those words not at the Dutch, but at those who came to the country and refused to integrate. Why were those words spoken? This is no longer just a matter of difficult integration. These are data that stir emotions, especially since, for example, Moroccan women maintain a fertility rate exceeding 2 children per woman. For comparison, Dutch women today average 1.47 children, which, by the way, isn't bad by European standard. But even today across the Netherlands, 27% of the population has a migrant background, and by 2050, it could be as high as 42%. This means a hard shift in the country's demographic and cultural structure. Tensions are rising between city and countryside, between the middle class and the elites, between those who want openness and those who ask whether their children will still live in a country they recognize. What's happening today in Amsterdam or Rotterdam has already played out in Berlin, Stockholm, Brussels, or Paris. Each of those cities had its breaking point. Sometimes a serious attack, sometimes riots, and sometimes just frustration that poured out at the ballot box. This isn't local hysteria, it's a continental crack. It's about principles, about who has the right to decide, the local community or the EU headquarters. Geert Wilders proposed something that not long ago would have sounded like heresy. But as it turns out, these are no longer fringe ideas. They're the main campaign pledges across half of Europe. Marine Le Pen is eyeing the Élysée Palace more seriously than ever. In Germany, AfD is surpassing the SPD despite media backlash. Giorgia Meloni shrugs off EU criticism and tightens Italy's borders. Also in Poland, the EU Migration Pact became the #1 issue in the last presidential election. The Netherlands may just be the first domino, the one that's already fallen. When a nation is liberal, affluent, and historically open as the Netherlands declares enough, it signals the end of some era in Europe and the dawn of something entirely new.
The United Kingdom is on the brink of collapse.
£7 million of taxpayers' money go to illegal migrants.
It was once said that the sun never set on the British Empire. The United Kingdom was a military, economic, and cultural powerhouse. However, today, that image is increasingly fading. A country that once ruled the world is now grappling with a severe crisis on its own doorstep, from an overburdened healthcare system to rising prices and escalating social tensions. For years, politicians assured that the country was heading in the right direction, yet more and more citizens feel that something has gone terribly wrong. On July 30th, 2024, the United Kingdom ignited. In the streets of London, Birmingham, and Manchester, thousands of people took to the streets to protest. The immediate cause was the murder of 3 girls by a 17-year-old Welshman, Axel Muganwa Rudakubana. Thousands of people demanded stricter immigration laws, greater protection for citizens, and the immediate deportation of illegal immigrants. In some cities, police cars were set on fire. As a result, over 400 people were detained and 100 faced charges. What happened in Southport became a symbol of the growing chaos that has been eroding the United Kingdom for years.
So no going out at dark. No. What can happen?
I've been out for years. I'm nearly 3 years of age. I've been out for years.
A few days after the riots, Prime Minister Keir Starmer also announced sentences for individuals who incited violence online. Authorities determined that false information and hate speech fueled the protests and escalated the violence. Sentences were handed down swiftly, and a wave of mass arrests ensued. Police analyzed social media and began mass detentions of individuals who posted content deemed to incite hatred. One of those arrested was Jordan Parler. The 28-year-old from Leeds was sentenced to 20 months in prison for a Facebook post in which he encouraged an attack on a hotel housing asylum seekers. Similarly, Tyler Kay, a 26-year-old from Northampton, received a 38-month prison sentence for a post encouraging arson. But that was just the beginning. There were many more arrests.
You have been committed for sentence, having pleaded guilty to an offence of publishing written material which is threatening, abusive, or insulting, intending thereby to stir up racial hatred.
In 2024, the United Kingdom did not publish exact statistics on arrest for online posts. However, journalists from The Times revealed that in 2017, over 3,300 people were arrested for online statements, an average of 9 people per day. Suddenly, voices emerged claiming that the United Kingdom was turning into a state where citizens are prosecuted for their views.
A little over 2 years ago, the British government charged Adam Smith Connor, a 51-year-old physiotherapist and an Army veteran, with the heinous crime of standing 50 meters from an abortion clinic and silently praying for 3 minutes. Just silently praying on his own. In Britain and across Europe, free speech, I fear, is in retreat.
Authorities defended their decisions, claiming they were combating extremism and incitement to violence. But others questioned whether this was truly about fighting violence, or rather suppressing dissent. Many Britons began to fear that expressing their opinions online could lead to arrest. These aren't just conspiracy theories. People are already being imprisoned for things that just a few years ago would have been considered merely controversial opinions.
We've had free speech for a very, very long time in the United Kingdom, and it will last for a very, very long time. In relation to free speech in the UK, I'm very proud of that.
This isn't the first time the United Kingdom has employed such drastic measures to control information. In the 20th century, the state censored media and films, fearing the spread of revolutionary ideas and the influence of communism. Even in the 1960s and 1970s, it censored content deemed harmful to societal values. But today's situation is entirely different, because back then it censored media, art, and journalists, whereas now anyone can become an inconvenient journalist. British society is deeply divided on this issue. Some believe that prosecuting hate speech is necessary for safety, while others say outright, this is the end of free speech. But this seems to be just the beginning. The ruling authorities are already announcing further tightening of misinformation laws while claiming that free speech will still be preserved. It's unclear what the next boundary will be, because once you start censoring people, it's hard to stop.
A woman has been arrested by Cheshire Police in relation to an inaccurate information on social media about the attacker in the Southport murders. It says a 55-year-old woman from near Chester was arrested on suspicion of publishing written material to stir up racial hatred and false communication.
The protests erupted across the United Kingdom. Censorship shocked society, but these problems didn't arise out of nowhere. They are the result of decisions made years ago, decisions that were supposed to change everything. In 2016, many Britons felt that the European Union no longer served their interests. The growing role of Brussels officials and the lack of control over their own borders led to the slogan, "Take Back Sovereignty," resonating strongly. Greater independence, full control over the economy, and their own rules without imposed directives from Brussels. It sounded like an ideal scenario. In the referendum, 52% of Britons voted to leave the European Union. It was one of the most significant votes in the country's history, a decision that was supposed to open a new chapter. Brexit supporters were confident that their country would be able to shape its policies on its own terms, and that the United Kingdom would regain its former glory.
Let's get Brexit done on October the 31st. Let's get it done because of the opportunities that it will bring, not just to take back control of our money and our borders and our laws, to regulate differently and better, to take our place as a proud and independent global campaigner for free trade. Let's get it done because delay is so pointless and expensive.
However, when Brexit became a reality in 2020, cracks began to appear in this vision. Many companies started to fail, legal chaos hit exports and imports, Britons didn't have to wait long to feel the effects of Brexit firsthand. Prices in stores soared, importing products became more expensive, and ordinary people began to notice that their wages weren't keeping up with the rising cost of living. The pound lost value, foreign investors held back, and the Bank of England began recording a decline in investments. The economy, which was supposed to grow, started to slow down, but it wasn't just the high cost of living that became a problem. After Brexit, about 600,000 workers from the European Union left the United Kingdom. Suddenly, companies began to struggle with staff shortages, and the government, which had promised to replace migrants with domestic labor, had no plan. In 2016, the majority supported Brexit, but by 2024, 60% of Britons believed it was a mistake. Sovereignty was supposed to give them control over the country, but instead of stability, stagnation emerged. Some companies moved operations abroad, investors began to avoid London, and the pound never returned to its former value. The biggest problem, however, was that now there was no easy solution. Returning to the Union was politically unrealistic, new trade agreements didn't replace access to the single market, and Britons found themselves in a situation they hadn't anticipated. But this is just the beginning, because the effects of Brexit are visible not only in the economy. Brexit was supposed to give Britons control over their borders and finally decide who could settle on the islands. The slogans about stopping uncontrolled migration were among the strongest arguments of those advocating leaving the European Union. Britons believed that Brexit would result in fewer immigrants. But the reality was quite the opposite. In 2022, the United Kingdom's net migration reached a record high of 745,000 people. However, one very important aspect changed. Migrants from the European Union indeed began to leave the United Kingdom. Poles, Romanians, and Lithuanians started returning to their countries or moving to Germany or Ireland, but others took their place. In 2022, over 1 million people from outside the European Union arrived in the United Kingdom. The most migrants came from India, Nigeria, Pakistan, and China. The government introduced new visa programs, hoping they would fill labor shortages in the economy.
Do you think there should be more immigration or less?
Less. You should stop it.
And not putting all these people into hotels when we've got our own people struggling, living on the streets is absolutely disgraceful.
The plan was simple. Since Britons no longer wanted to perform certain jobs, new arrivals would do them. But reality showed something entirely different. Instead of working in key sectors, more and more people began to rely on the welfare system. The British budget, already strained after the pandemic and Brexit, had to bear even greater burdens. The housing situation also became dire. Rental prices soared and housing availability dropped to record lows. This quickly sparked public outrage. Britons who were themselves struggling with the cost of living crisis had to watch as the state spent billions of pounds to support new citizens. In large cities like London, Manchester, and Birmingham, brutal street attacks became increasingly common. A particularly troubling trend was the rising number of knife attacks. Every day in British cities, there were several such incidents. Society increasingly felt that the state had lost control over the streets and that law enforcement was more concerned with political correctness than effectively combating crime. People began to feel that if they didn't take care of their own safety, no one else would.
The number of people entering the UK illegally in small boats has more than quadrupled in just the last 2 years. Those illegally crossing the Channel are not directly fleeing a war-torn country, or persecution, or an imminent threat to life.
Instead of real reforms and attempts to rebuild stability, the government employs ad hoc measures that don't solve the problem. And ordinary citizens feel increasingly afraid to leave their homes after dark. The problems didn't spare the public healthcare system in the United Kingdom, known worldwide for its extensive healthcare network. The National Health Service, an institution that for decades was the cornerstone of the country's healthcare system, found itself on the brink of exhaustion. One of the main problems facing the NHS is the shortage of medical staff. As a result of Brexit, many nurses and doctors from European Union countries decided to leave the United Kingdom. As a result, hospitals across the country are overwhelmed. There's a shortage of doctors, nurses, orderlies, and other medical staff. You wait months for surgery and even longer for a specialist appointment. Successive governments promised to improve the situation, but were unable to effectively fulfill their promises. The Conservative Party is now on the verge of collapse. After years of leadership, without a strong leader, they have become a symbol of chaos and incompetence. Political turmoil, disastrous economic decisions, and a lack of a coherent vision for the future have caused their support to plummet dramatically. They once dominated, and now they fight for survival. In just a few years, the United Kingdom has had 5 prime ministers. After Boris Johnson, who lost power amid scandals, came the brief and catastrophic tenure of Liz Truss, lasting only 49 days.
Unless we get a grip and change the way our countries work, the West will be finished in 10 years. And we have been threatened by left-wing ideology.
Her economic decisions led to a sharp fall in the value of the pound, one of the biggest financial shocks in modern British history. Rishi Sunak, who took over, failed to rebuild public trust. His government could not deal with inflation, the energy crisis, or the mounting problems in the healthcare system. What's more, the fall of the Conservatives may accelerate the process of the United Kingdom's disintegration. Scotland is increasingly demanding a second independence referendum, and separatist sentiments in Northern Ireland are stronger than ever.
Let's hope to gain our independence because we deserve it and we're being mistreated by the Westminster government for the last 300 years.
If political chaos deepens over the coming years, the United Kingdom may face a real threat of breaking apart, something that a decade ago would have sounded like an implausible scenario.
Qu'avez-vous fait de la France?
Not long ago, France stood as a shining emblem of the Western ideal, a land of fine cuisine and effortless elegance. But today, that image is little more than a fading memory. In Paris, under the watch of ancient monuments, rows of homeless tents stretch along the streets. In the suburbs, cars are set on fire. For many, even basic costs are a monthly struggle. And lately, Marine Le Pen, the leading opposition figure, has been arrested. Once a model of cultural pride, France is slipping into crisis. Because today, what remains is not a fairy tale, but a cautionary tale for all of Europe. During World War II, France was attacked by Germany and forced to surrender. That decision was also partly made to avoid the total destruction of its cities, like Paris, for example. Despite the capitulation, the country was left in ruins. Yet just a few years later, the country rebuilt itself with incredible determination. General de Gaulle established a strong, independent state that sought to be neither American nor Soviet, but distinctly French.
Française, Français, de quoi s'inspire, en quoi consiste la Constitution qui, le 28 septembre, sera soumise à vos suffrages. Au nom de la France, je vous demande de répondre oui. Vive la République, vive la France!
The 1960s and 1970s brought economic miracles. Highways, railways, large factories, modern housing estates, and hospital networks emerged. Generation after generation, the French lived better, worked shorter hours, earned more, and had access to free healthcare and education. Paris became the capital of style, taste, and culture. French cuisine, cinema, and fashion. It all became export-quality trademarks. But this sense of pride began to crumble. Today, walking those same streets, one no longer sees just elegance and chic. Official data indicates over 330,000 homeless people. Since 2001, in Paris alone, the number of homeless individuals has increased more than 5-fold. Beside museums and opera houses lie people wrapped in blankets, covered with plastic. These are no longer isolated cases, but a wave growing each year. Instead of addressing the issue, authorities attempt to sweep it under the rug. Before the 2024 Olympic Games, Paris aimed to shine in the world's eyes. According to Le Monde, city officials began relocating the homeless from the center. Buses headed toward makeshift centers outside Paris. Not to help, but to remove them from sight. After all, hundreds of homeless individuals near the Louvre would not look good on live broadcasts. The Olympics were meant to showcase a modern and beautiful France, not a country where people sleep on concrete. But the problem no longer affects just the margins. Increasingly, people with full-time jobs sleep on the streets. The French term, working poor, is no longer a statistical footnote. Even those with higher education can find themselves on the streets, after a divorce, for example. While social programs do exist, far too many fall through the cracks. A nation once seen as a beacon of solidarity and equality now struggles with the most fundamental human need, providing a roof over people's heads. Yet not everyone sleeps on the streets. Some people still manage, though increasingly only on paper. Today's France, especially in big cities, is a country where even a normal life becomes a luxury.
Et moi, je voudrais juste, pour finir vraiment en un mot, rappeler qu'en France, il y a 10 millions de pauvres. Qu'en France, il y a des étudiants qui font la queue pour l'aide alimentaire. Qu'en France, pendant 5 ans, les 5% les plus pauvres du pays se sont appauvris encore plus. Et que face à ça, on ne fait rien et que
Just a few years ago, France's middle class lived with a sense of stability. Salaries covered the essentials, the rent, the bills, a seaside vacation. Today, that lifestyle feels like a relic. Prices have spiraled out of control. Bread, milk, vegetables, all up by 30, 40, even 60%. Gasoline has hovered above €2 per liter for months. Electricity, gas, and heating bills climb relentlessly, month after month. And rents in some cities have jumped 17% in a single year. But the most striking image, one that repeats itself across thousands of towns and neighborhoods, is the line outside the food bank. Elderly people, women with children, young men after work, all stand silently for a package of pasta and a can of beans. 2 million people per month rely on food aid, almost twice as many as before the pandemic. And these aren't just the unemployed. 1 in 5 people in this queue works full-time. They work but can't afford food. France has created a new symbol, the working hungry person. And when the state can't provide shelter, jobs, or a sense of security, frustration eventually explodes. In France, it no longer takes much to take to the streets. Today, the country boils almost every day. Everyone protests. Nurses, teachers, drivers, farmers, students, retirees. But this anger didn't arise out of nowhere. It built up over years. It all started with the Yellow Vests, a protest by people from the provinces who said, enough. Blocked roundabouts, burning shops, clashes with the police. It was the cry of the middle class, which suddenly realized it was no longer middle class. And then President Macron added fuel to the fire.
À partir de l'été 2023, on devra décaler l'âge légal de départ de 4 mois par an. Ce qui veut dire que là où nous sommes aujourd'hui à 62 ans, on passera à horizon 2025 à 63 ans, à horizon 2028 à 64 ans et à horizon 2031 à 65 ans.
He raised the retirement age from 62 to 64, without a parliamentary vote, without asking anyone's consent. He pushed the law through using a controversial article of the Constitution. The French felt disregarded and deceived. In polls, Macron melted like butter in the sun, and although he survived politically, socially he ceased to exist. But the real explosion occurred only after a tragedy. June 2023 was a dark moment for France. A 17-year-old named Nahel was shot and killed by police. According to France 24, over 1,000 buildings and 5,000 cars burned. In Marseille and Paris, shops and police stations were set ablaze. Some said it resembled a civil war. Everything was set on fire, even the mayor's house, whose family had to flee over a fence when Molotov cocktails exploded at the door. Unfortunately, this is no longer an exception, but a sad French tradition. Today, protests don't have a single goal or demand. But this anger didn't arise in a vacuum. In many French cities, there are districts where the state doesn't have full control. Many people downplay this phenomenon, but in France, some sources report about 750 such areas. Officially called sensitive urban zones, these 751 areas have been drifting toward collapse for years. Take one of them, La Castellane in Marseille. This 1960s housing estate was built with good intentions. It was meant to provide shelter for working migrants. Today, it's a symbol of the failure of French housing policy. From the outside, it's a row of gray blocks separated from the rest of the city by tracks and walls. And inside, 40% unemployment, gangs recruiting kids. Here, no one calls the police because it's known they either won't come or will need special unit support. In 2023, the district became infamous for a series of gang-related conflicts. Among other incidents, there were shootings with AK-47 in the middle of the street. Several people died. Some were under 18. It's neighborhoods like these that gave rise to members of DZ Mafia and Jody, two rival gangs fighting for control over Marseille drug market. The government, of course, promises to tackle the problem. President Emmanuel Macron announced a police operation in March 2024 aimed at restoring public order.
La sécurité, nous la ferons ici aussi, avec de nouveaux moyens, des nouvelles responsabilités pour nos forces de l'ordre, des nouveaux pouvoirs d'amende ou d'éloignement du territoire, et avec une politique claire. La tolérance zéro à l'égard de la délinquance, tolérance zéro à l'égard de toute dérive policière.
As part of this operation, which lasted several weeks, a total of 12,000 police and gendarmerie officers were mobilized, conducting intensive actions in Marseille and surrounding municipalities. The goal was to dismantle criminal networks and drug dealers who had made residents' lives unbearable. During the operation, over 80 people were arrested. In addition to direct operations, a total of 12 billion euros has already been allocated for the revitalization of such districts. It sounds beautiful, but as residents say, trees won't stop bullets. Because in France, one no longer needs a war to die from military-grade weapons. It's enough to be born on the wrong side of the tracks. For decades, France took pride in its model of integration, a system built on the belief that anyone born on French soil would become French, no matter their skin color or language. But this assumption had a fundamental flaw. It ignored history. After World War II, France needed labor. From former colonies, especially in North Africa, millions arrived. Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians worked in factories, on construction sites, in dishwashing jobs. They were promised integration. Their children were to live better than their fathers. But that simply didn't happen. What emerged weren't communities, but ghettos, and a wave of statistics that make your blood run cold. According to a 2023 Paris Police Prefecture report, 77% of street rapes in Paris were committed by foreigners. According to the French Ministry of the Interior, in 2023, foreigners made up 7% of the population, but accounted for 25% of those incarcerated. This doesn't mean every migrant is a criminal, but the numbers are unequivocal and show that the integration system isn't working as promised.
L'insécurité est devenue le quotidien de millions de Français. Chaque jour, on compte 3 homicides, 1000 agressions violentes, 600 cambriolages, 330 vols avec armes. Une France orange mécanique, nourrie par le flux grandissant d'une immigration de masse de plus en plus incontrôlée.
Young people who don't feel French seek identity in gangs or radicalism, and this affects all immigrants and native French alike. This is no longer just a problem of the first generation. The second generation, children born in France, often become more radical than their parents. Without opportunities, without a sense of belonging, without trust in the state. In 2024, something occurred that a decade ago would have sounded like political fiction. Emmanuel Macron's government collapsed. Gabriel Attal was supposed to mark a new beginning. But instead of governing lawfully, he was the prime minister for only 8 months. No majority in parliament, no approved budget for 2025, and rising public debt. This isn't an opposition campaign slogan, it's the current reality inside the Élysée Palace. The state began to waver, and the government simply stopped working. Meanwhile, Marine Le Pen kept gaining strength.
Qu'avez-vous fait de la France? Qu'avez-vous fait pour transformer notre pays parmi les plus courtois, les plus élégants et les plus doux de la terre pour en faire un enfer? Ce spectacle afflige le monde entier et notre pays qui fut tant admiré pour son rayonnement intellectuel et sa puissance suscite aujourd'hui la pitié quand ce n'est pas l'ironie.
Her party, the National Rally, tripled its vote count in just 2 years. About 12 million voters, more than any other party. When the government is powerless and the cities are on fire, people vote for whoever at least promises them water. Le Pen and the National Rally gained popularity, especially in places where people had already had enough of the chaos. For many, it was a desperate hope for order. According to Reuters, Le Pen was convicted of misappropriating 4.33 million euros in EU funds. The sentence, 4 years in prison, 2 of them suspended. Also a 100,000 euros fine and a 5-year ban from holding public office. That means Le Pen won't be allowed to run in the 2027 presidential election unless the appeals court overturns the ruling. But the problems don't end there. Beneath the surface of political shockwaves lies another looming crisis. France, once considered a pillar of Eurozone stability, now faces serious economic challenges. Its public debt has surpassed 3.3 trillion euros. That's already 113% of GDP, and it's still climbing. French government bonds are now as risky as Greek ones used to be. Let's remember, not long ago, France was the financial mentor of Greece. Today, it shares nearly the same level of debt, and nobody seems surprised anymore. But it's not just public debt that's keeping people awake at night. According to Le Monde, in the first quarter of 2025, the French economy grew by only 0.1%. Turkey is a country that doesn't have to try too hard to exert influence over Europe. A bridge between Europe and Asia, control over the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits, access to both the Mediterranean and Black Seas, and a border with Syria, Iraq, and Iran. The list could go on, but the conclusion remains the same. Turkey's location ensures it is always in the game, and it has been this way for centuries. But today, in the 21st century, Turkey holds something far more problematic in its hands: the migration route. This powerful political tool allows Ankara to influence Europe like never before. Not through diplomacy, not through trade, but through a flood of people trying to reach the West. And it is precisely this factor that has turned Turkey into one of the European Union's biggest problems. Because now, it is not Europe that decides who crosses its border. It is Erdogan. It all began in 2015 with the onset of the migration crisis. At first, it seemed that Europe would manage the situation. After all, it wasn't the first migration crisis in history, and politicians assured everyone that everything was under control. Angela Merkel declared willkommen. Germany opened its doors and grand words were spoken about solidarity and the need to help people fleeing war. That year, over 1.3 million migrants arrived in Europe. In Germany alone, 890,000 asylum applications were filed, and those were just the official figures. No one really knew how many people had actually crossed the borders. Many lacked documents, and verifying identities was nearly impossible.
Thousands of refugees amassing along the Greek and Bulgarian borders. Men, women and children who are being held in Turkish migrant camps are being bussed to the border by Turkish officials.
And that's when something started to change. At first, there were only isolated warning voices, but with each passing week, tensions grew. Reports started emerging about integration problems, conflicts in shelters, and crimes. But that was only the beginning. Within months, the situation spiraled out of control. More and more cities announced they had no more room for newcomers. The costs of social welfare were skyrocketing. Europe realized no one had any control over the situation. It was too late to reverse the decisions already made. Some countries began seeking their own solutions. Hungary was the first to erect a wall on its border. Austria announced it would start controlling its border crossings. But that wasn't enough because the human waves kept coming. The European Union went into panic mode, and that's when the idea emerged to strike a deal with Turkey.
First of all, political agreement by both sides, the EU and Turkey, about what we call, in simpler terms, regulating the irregular migration.
The country through which most migrants were passing was supposed to become Europe's gatekeeper. Brussels hailed it as a great success. The European Union would pay Turkey billions of euros, and in return Ankara would keep the migrants on its own territory. Sounds reasonable, doesn't it? Maybe on paper, because paper will tolerate anything. Unfortunately, no one thought about one key thing. Politics is a ruthless game of interests, not a festival of goodwill. If you pay someone to do something you should be doing yourself, what will stop them from demanding even more next time? Did Europeans really think Erdogan would stop the migrants out of pure goodwill? It was a perfect opportunity to play Europe like amateurs, and Turkey seized it without a shred of hesitation. They got billions of euros but had no real incentive to actually solve the problem. And what did the EU do?
And this is what we keep saying since Friday. The EU is sticking to its part of the deal. We stand to this EU-Turkey statement, and we expect Turkey to honor the commitments which are stemming for the Turkish side from this agreement, so that we can continue working on this, on the delivery, because we in the EU see this statement as a fundamental part and building block of our overall relations.
It kept pretending everything was under control. It kept believing Erdogan would play fair. It kept paying. And that's the biggest absurdity of this whole story. Instead of solving the crisis, EU trapped itself. Now it wasn't Brussels deciding about migration. It was the goodwill of a Turkish dictator. What a brilliant decision, right? Erdogan now held the bargaining chip, and he quickly learned how to use it. In March 2016, Brussels signed an agreement with Ankara that was supposed to end the migration crisis. After months of chaos, social pressure, and rising tensions across Europe, EU leaders wanted one thing: to close the migration route through Turkey to Greece. The solution seemed simple. Turkey agreed to keep migrants on its territory and accept those who had illegally reached Europe. In return, Ankara would receive 6 billion euros for refugee assistance and a promise to lift visa requirements for Turks entering the Schengen zone. For European politicians, it was a moment of triumph. The crisis seemed to be over, and the statistics quickly showed a decline in migrant numbers. But once the initial optimism faded, problems began to surface. In practice, it turned out that, as always, the system was slow, complicated, and full of legal loopholes. Deporting migrants back to Turkey took months, and in many cases, it was impossible altogether. Thousands of people were simply stuck in camps, waiting for decisions that never came. Things got even messier when it came to money. The Union promised billions of euros for humanitarian aid in Turkey, but the payments were made in stages. Erdogan quickly realized this was an excellent bargaining chip. Whenever Ankara needed more money, all it had to do was hint that the terms of the agreement weren't being met, and that Turkey's borders might once again open. And what about the promise of lifting visas for Turkish citizens? Brussels never fulfilled that part of the deal. The Union explained that Turkey wasn't meeting all the conditions, but for Erdogan it was just another excuse to break the agreement.
Il y a
There is a need for checks on people who pass through Turkish territory. We know there are foreign fighters who have that intention and who use this route. Secondly, there are also terrorists who could infiltrate. We've seen that with the attacks in Paris.
As a result, Turkey kept receiving billions while still holding all the cards. The EU thought it was buying peace, but instead it created a mechanism Erdogan could turn against Europe at any time, and he quickly did just that. Each year, Ankara started raising the stakes. Turkey demanded additional financial support, a resumption of EU membership negotiations, and political concessions. And when Europe refused to meet its demands, Erdogan wasn't bluffing. In October 2019, Turkey gradually began to reduce border security. Thousands of migrants once again started moving towards Greece. Erdogan was testing Europe's reaction, seeing how far he could push. When he saw Brussels remaining passive, he decided to go even further. At the beginning of 2020, Turkey officially announced it would no longer block migration. The borders were officially opened, and within days thousands of people arrived on Greek islands. Camps that were already overcrowded collapsed. But that wasn't all. This time, it wasn't just refugees from Syria or Afghanistan. Turkish prisons released individuals who had previously been detained there. Greek officials warned that among the new wave of migrants were ISIS fighters. Once again, Europe had no plan. Turkey had long understood that if it wanted something from Europe, it didn't need to negotiate. It just had to open the borders.
And we are sending a very, very clear signal that migrants and refugees cannot be used as instruments, as pawns in a geopolitical game. They are the true victims of these types of policies.
Despite the growing threat, the European Union did nothing to stop Erdogan, and the billions it kept transferring to Turkey weren't just spent on building schools and hospitals. A significant portion of that money funded the Turkish army, government investments, and sustained Erdogan's influence. Refugees became not just a tool of blackmail, but also a business that Turkey exploited to strengthen its position. Meanwhile, Europe continued its open-door policy, and countries that opposed migration, like Poland and Hungary, were punished for their lack of solidarity. Brussels was more concerned with forcing migrant relocation than addressing the real problem. Meanwhile, Turkey grew bolder. Erdogan proved that Europe could be intimidated. Just open the borders and Brussels would retreat on its own. Yet instead of learning from this, the Union kept wiring more billions, hoping Ankara would finally keep its word. But the conclusion should be obvious. You do not negotiate with dictators, because every compromise is an invitation for more demands. This is not the first time Turkey has shown it can play the West like a fiddle. When Sweden wanted to join NATO after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Ankara suddenly started setting conditions. Erdogan demanded the extradition of Kurdish activists, changes to Sweden's anti-terrorism laws, and the freezing of support for Kurdish organizations. Let's remember, we are talking about a country seeking to join a military alliance during a time of global threat. And Turkey couldn't care less. It used the moment to bargain for its own gains. In the end, Erdogan graciously agreed to Sweden's accession, but only after hearing about specific benefits.
Let me be the very first to welcome Sweden as a party to the Washington Treaty and the 32nd member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Thankfully, not everyone is so naive to fall for dictators' political gains. Poland, though often criticized for it, chose a hardline stance, and with the benefit of hindsight, we see it was the right choice. Turkey is not the only country to use migrants to pressure the European Union. In 2021, Alexander Lukashenko applied a similar strategy, sparking an artificially induced crisis at the borders of Poland, Lithuania, and Latvia. The scenario was almost identical to Erdogan's, except migrants were brought to Belarus and then transported toward the border. The Belarusian regime hoped the Union would cave, accept the people, and lift sanctions imposed after the fraudulent presidential elections. But this time, things went differently. Lukashenko tried, but Poland said no, and it worked.
This is the Poland army. We are trying to go. We are not doing anything. Shoot me.
Instead of negotiating and sending billions, Poland opted for a hardline border defense. A border wall was erected, a strict policy of pushbacks was introduced, and Polish services refused to allow migrants to enter. Pressure from Brussels to open the borders failed. Poland didn't yield, and it worked. The crisis that was supposed to serve Lukashenko as a tool of political pressure ended in failure. The EU didn't lift sanctions, and the border remained sealed. Belarus, having no more bargaining chips, achieved nothing politically. And this shows one thing: migration blackmail can be stopped. You just need the will. It's just a pity that all these efforts made by Poles may now be wasted with the announced migrant relocations from Germany. Both situations had a lot in common. Both Turkey and Belarus used migrants as leverage against Europe. However, it is clear that blackmail against Europe is only a fragment of Turkey's broader game. Erdogan doesn't just want to be a leader in his own country. He wants Turkey to become a regional power, and he's making that happen. From the Caucasus through Syria, all the way to Greece, Ankara is entering conflicts, supporting some, fighting others, and constantly expanding its reach. Erdogan's ambitions extend far beyond Europe. One key area of this competition is the Caucasus, where the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia has been ongoing for years. Turkey has long supported Azerbaijan, both politically and militarily, consistently undermining Russian influence in the region. For Erdogan, this is not just a strategic alliance, it's a way to show the world that Ankara calls the shots in the Middle East and Central Asia. A pivotal moment came in 2020 when the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict escalated into open war. Turkey supplied Azerbaijan with weapons, drones, and military support. All of that enabled Baku to achieve a swift victory over Armenia. Russia stayed on the sidelines, giving Erdogan and Azerbaijan a free hand to achieve their goals. This victory was not only a military triumph, but also a political success for Turkey, which strengthened its influence in the Caucasus and sent a clear message to the world. Ankara is not afraid of open conflicts if there is something to gain. However, the Caucasus is just one of the fronts where Turkey is trying to expand its influence. Another equally dangerous flashpoint is its eternal rival, Greece. Although both countries are members of NATO, their relations have remained tense for years. The main source of conflict is territorial disputes in the Aegean Sea, especially around islands like Castellorizo or Mace. Greece considers them its own, but Turkey regularly challenges their status. These tensions aren't just political sparring matches. There have already been military incidents, and in 2020, both countries were on the brink of war.
Ey Yunan, bak tarihe bak. Tarihe dön. Çok daha fazla ileri gidersen bunun bedeli ağır olur, ağır.
The flashpoint was the discovery of gas and oil deposits in the Mediterranean. Ankara decided to start prospecting in waters that Greece considers part of its exclusive economic zone. Athens treated this as a violation of its sovereignty, and the situation quickly escalated. Turkey sent its warships, and Greece responded by mobilizing its fleet. Conflict was hanging by a thread. Cyprus is another critical point on Turkey's map of expansion. Once again, the flashpoint was the oil and gas fields in the Mediterranean. This small island has long been a source of conflict between Ankara, Greece, and the European Union. For Erdogan, controlling Cyprus is not just a matter of prestige, but a step towards cementing Turkey's status as a regional power. The conflict dates back to 1974, when Turkey invaded the northern part of the island. The pretext was a coup organized by Greek nationalists who wanted to unite Cyprus with Greece. Ankara seized the moment, sent in its army, and took control over the island's northern part. Since then, Cyprus remains divided, with Turkey recognizing the north as an independent Turkish Cypriot state, though no other countries do so. For decades, Turkey has also pursued an aggressive military policy towards Syria under the pretext of defending its borders. Officially, military operations aimed to protect Turkey from terrorists, but in reality, it was about expanding Turkey's sphere of influence in the Middle East. Human rights organizations accuse Turkey of attacking civilians, violating human rights, and infringing Syrian sovereignty. Erdogan rebuffs these accusations, claiming that his country must safeguard its own security, and that the West simply doesn't understand the region's realities. Erdogan wants to be seen as the leader of the Muslim world, and intervention in Syria grants him the status of a player unafraid to use force. Turkey not only defends its borders, but seeks to reshape the entire region. Erdogan would very much like Turkey to become a second Russia, a state that can enter conflicts with impunity.
Ve belgeleri yırtıp atacak siyasi, ekonomik ve askeri güce sahip olduğunu anlayacaklar. Ya siyasetin ve diplomasinin diliyle anlayacaklar ya da sahada yaşayacakları acı tecrübelerle anlayacaklar.
The problem, however, is that Turkey's economy can't sustain such ambitions. Despite Erdogan's efforts to portray Turkey as a regional powerhouse, the domestic situation is dire. For several years now, Turkey has been grappling with a currency crisis. The Turkish lira has been plummeting at a dizzying rate. Since 2008, its value against the dollar has dropped by 96%. Today, getting a dollar with lira costs nearly 25 times more than it did just a few years ago. On top of that comes inflation, which in recent years has consistently exceeded 80%, and unofficially at times even hit 150%. The prices of food, fuel, and basic services rise month after month. Savings evaporate, loans become unpayable, and the young generation loses hope for a stable future. But Erdogan didn't think it was time to step down, quite the opposite. In March 2025, his biggest political rival, Istanbul's mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, was sentenced to prison for insulting officials. In reality, he was simply too popular and could have won future elections. Protests broke out across the streets, people shouting for freedom and democracy, but the government responded with force. Erdogan seized control of the courts, the media, the police, and the army. Today, he decides who can run in elections and who lands behind bars. In practice, Turkey hasn't been a democracy for a long time. It's a country where the president rules by decree, imprisons opponents, and controls all institutions.
Avrupa Birliği güç ve irtifa kaybının önüne geçmek, hatta tersine çevirmek istiyorsa bunu ancak Türkiye'nin tam üyeliğiyle başarabilir. Polonya'nın üyelik sürecimize yönelik desteğini artırarak sürdürmesine dair beklentimi Sayın Tusk'la paylaştım.
And all of this in a country that's a NATO member and has been negotiating EU accession for years. And the EU has handed over its security into the hands of such a man. They might as well ask Putin to cover European states under his nuclear umbrella.
Spain has serious trouble.
La degradación es total.
From the outside, Spain looks to many like a dream come true. What more could one want, right? But a closer look is enough to see that the picture is incomplete. For Spaniards themselves, that dream is becoming harder and harder to attain. In recent years, housing prices have literally skyrocketed. In Madrid or Barcelona, renting a single room can consume more than half of one's salary. Young people can't afford independence. Many of them only work part-time with no guarantee for the future. At the same time, the big cities are being flooded with newcomers, migrants, tourists, or investors. Across the country, people say that Spain is beautiful, but only for those who weren't born here. Because for many residents, Spain has become a luxury they simply cannot afford. Just 2 decades ago, Spain was a European success story. After joining the European Union in 1986, the economy picked up speed. Billions of euros flowed in from structural funds and cheap credit, and entirely new city districts were growing month after month. It was a time of massive construction boom. Between 1997 and 2007, Spain built more homes than Germany, France, and the United Kingdom combined. In 2006 alone, over 860,000 new homes were completed, an absolute record on a European scale. The construction sector then employed as many as 2.5 million people, more than any other sector in the country. For many, it was a golden ticket. Without formal education, one could earn several thousand euros a month. A belief was born that owning a home wasn't a privilege, it was a given. Mortgages were easily accessible. Banks were offering loans of 100 to 120%, and sometimes even more. In just 10 years, between 1996 and 2007, property prices rose by over 200%. Buying 2 or 3 apartments for rental, convinced that this would never lose value. But it was all built on cheap credit and artificially inflated demand. When the financial bubble burst in the US in 2008, Spain fell into an abyss. Unemployment rose from 8% to over 26%, and among young people to as high as 55%. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs, especially in construction. The market froze. Banks repossessed homes that couldn't be paid off. That's when the scale of the madness came to light. Hundreds of thousands of newly built apartments stood empty. Some housing developments were never completed. Across the country, ghost towns sprang up, full of new but uninhabited buildings. Paradoxically, although Spain lacked affordable housing, millions of units remained unused. Harsh austerity measures followed the crisis. Wages in the public sector were frozen, pensions and benefits were cut. A generation that just a few years earlier had been fed hope for success was left with nothing. Spain has always had a problem with unemployment. Even in the prosperous years of the late 1990s, unemployment exceeded 20%. And among youth it surpassed 40%. Only the construction boom between 2002 and 2007 reduced it to 7.9%. But that was an artificial effect driven by cheap credit and real estate, which alone employed up to 2.4 million people. When the bubble burst in 2008, everything came back with a vengeance. By 2013, unemployment had reached 26%. Construction lost 1.4 million jobs. Housing prices fell by 15%, and thousands of people lost their life savings. Today, if you look only at the statistics, it may seem like everything is back to normal. Unemployment has dropped to 10.6%. Construction is booming again, and housing prices are at record highs. But in truth, Spain never fully recovered. Precarious work still dominates, with temporary contracts, insecurity, and a lack of structural reform. Beneath the surface of optimism, the same mechanisms are once again visible. Easy credit, fast speculative profit. In the background, a new bubble is forming, and everything indicates that no lessons were learned. In Madrid or Barcelona, renting a small apartment today can cost 1,200 euros, sometimes even 1,400 euros per month. Just a decade ago, you could find something similar for half that amount. But salaries haven't doubled. So who are these apartments for? Certainly not for the people who work here.
Lamento tener que comparecer en estas circunstancias, pero nadie, y digo nadie, que tenga un mínimo de aprecio a nuestro país, puede ignorar el estado de putrefacción al que nos tiene sometido el actual gobierno. La degradación es total. Ha llegado el momento de que la mayoría de los españoles decentes entendamos y reaccionemos ante lo que está en juego.
At first glance, the housing problem in Spain seems to concern only the big cities. But that's not entirely true. Spain is a country of contrasts. Nearly 70% of its territory is depopulated or sparsely populated, while the population is concentrated in just a few metropolitan areas: Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, and Malaga. These places attract both Spaniards and newcomers from around the world, tourists, digital nomads, and investors. Meanwhile, according to 2021 data, as many as 14% of homes across the country, about 3.8 million properties, stand empty. It's a real paradox. On the one hand, a dramatic housing crisis and a lack of available units. On the other, millions of unoccupied homes. A significant portion of them are investment properties bought up by REIT-type funds like Blackstone, Cerberus, or Lone Star that convert them into luxury apartments, short-term rentals, or simply hold them as financial assets. In large cities, such funds often acquire entire apartment blocks, renovate them, and rent them out via Airbnb. Ordinary people can no longer afford to live in the center. Their options are either moving back in with their parents or commuting daily from the suburbs. Worse still, the market favors not those who work hard, but those who earn in dollars or inherited a property. For years, the situation was further complicated by laws protecting so-called ocupas, squatters who illegally occupied other people's homes. Owners often couldn't evict them for many months, sometimes even years. Only recently have laws slowly started to change. The police can now react faster and property owners have gained greater protection. But the problems don't end there. Spain's population has begun to grow again, but not thanks to Spaniards' children, rather due to migration. The biggest influx is from Colombia, Venezuela, Morocco, and sub-Saharan African countries. More and more people from these regions are settling permanently, mainly in large cities. This further fuels housing demand, increases competition in the job market, and deepens social inequality. In 2025, Spain is planning to introduce a 100% tax on the purchase of homes by non-EU citizens. This means that if, for example, a Russian, an American, or a Saudi citizen wants to buy a home in Spain, they have to pay twice the price. It's a response from the government to growing social pressure and an attempt to halt the wave of speculative purchases that have driven up prices and pushed local residents out of the market. And the scale of this phenomenon has been massive. It is estimated that 1 in 5 properties in Spain is purchased by foreigners. Leading the pack are the British, Germans, and Moroccans. But the number of Poles is also rising, treating Spanish real estate as an investment or a way to escape Polish winters. For an investor from Berlin or London, it's often just a holiday apartment. For a Spaniard, it's an unattainable luxury in their own city. On paper, Spain is a developed, popular, and beautiful country. But for millions of ordinary people, it is becoming less and less accessible. Worse still, another factor is entering the game: tourism. Because if homes aren't for the residents but are bought by investors, then who are they really for? Barcelona is one of the most beautiful cities in Europe. The famous Gaudi buildings, narrow alleyways, and Gothic quarters. But just try living there. There are apartments, but not for you. They're for tourists for a few days, not for years. At night you have noise, parties, lost foreigners, wandering around with GPS in hand. Barcelona attracts over 12 million tourists a year. That's more than the city's entire population. On paper, that's a success for the authorities. A source of revenue, a goldmine for hoteliers. But for ordinary residents, it's a daily torment. Prices rise, local shops disappear, schools are overcrowded, and public transport is bursting at the seams. Ordinary life becomes impossible. There are no longer bakeries, laundromats, or greengrocers in the city center, but there are trendy bars, fast food joints, and boutique hostels. The authorities are trying to do something about it, but it's too little. Locals have had enough. More and more frequently anti-tourism graffiti appears on the walls. Tourism, once the savior of Spain after the 2008 crisis, is now devouring it from the inside. Cities are no longer for people. They are becoming products.
Tengan un turismo sostenible que permita también vivir la gente que pueda vivir del turismo, pero que permita un turismo sostenible que no impida que los vecinos hagan su vida normal en los barrios.
Despite this, a wave of enthusiasm has been echoing throughout the media in recent months. Admittedly, the numbers look impressive. GDP is growing faster than in Germany or France. Exports are holding strong, tourism is breaking records. But that's only half the truth. Spain's real GDP, adjusted for inflation, still hasn't returned to its pre-2008 crisis level. That means that after 17 years, the country is still trying to climb out of the same hole it fell into when the housing bubble burst. Unemployment remains high, on average 12.5% and often over 25% among young people. That's one of the worst results in the entire European Union. Only a few southern countries, such as Greece, fare worse. And here arises a question worth asking every economic optimist. Does macroeconomics tell us the whole truth about how people live? Because numbers may look good, but if your salary doesn't cover rent, if half of young adults live with their parents, if entire neighborhoods are turning into Airbnb zones, then maybe not everything is working the way the statistics suggest. Let's see how this compares with Poland. Poland's real GDP has long surpassed the pre-2008 level, and in the last decade it has grown by over 40%. Despite inflation and external crises, Poland still maintains relatively balanced public finances. And what about Western Europe? Germany and France are struggling with different problems: growth stagnation and industrial decline. Their GDPs are virtually flat. But unlike Spain, their labor markets are more stable, and levels of wages and productivity are significantly higher. Spain shines in the headlines, but the reality is far more complex. All of this suggests that enthusiasm should be taken with a grain of salt. From a distance, Spain still looks like paradise, and maybe it is for a week or two on vacation. But to live here, raise a child, pay the bills, and save for the future, well, that's a completely different story.
Migrants are arriving uninvited and refusing to adopt Danish customs.
We're not interested in getting a whole lot of people who we're supposed to integrate.
For years, Denmark has ranked at the top when it comes to quality of life, social trust, education, and healthcare. For decades, they acted like a magnet for migrants. Denmark was once a symbol of liberal Europe, but today something has changed. The country that once proudly spoke of integration is now doing everything it can to reduce the number of migrants and to send back those who have already arrived. Prime Minister Frederiksen puts it bluntly.
How can I put it? We don't have a lot of time because in almost all European countries, our populations are saying it has gone too far. The uncontrolled migration, it's not working in our daily life, and we are on the same page as them, and therefore we are willing to take new decisions and to open new discussions.
And what's more, it doesn't matter whether the Social Democrats or the Liberals are in power. The Danish line is clear and consistent. We don't want to become another Sweden. To understand today's Danish migration policy, one has to go back to the roots of its greatest pride, the welfare state. Its beginnings date to the late 19th century, when Denmark was among the first countries to introduce universal health and pension insurance. The idea was born that the state has a duty to take care of its citizens, not as a favor, but as a right. After World War II, this model accelerated. Denmark, which avoided destruction on the scale seen in Poland, Germany, or France, began investing in its society. In the 1950s and 1960s, housing programs were developed. Healthcare was expanded, unemployment benefits were introduced, and education became not only free but universally accessible. This system still functions today and is considered as a model by many. Danes can count on a year-long parental leave, high-quality public health care, and social assistance when they need it most. But there's one condition. Everyone must contribute to the system. The average tax rate in Denmark is about 46%, one of the highest in the world. Yet trust in the state and public institutions remains very high. Danes understand that it's a fair deal. This belief is not marginal. However, problems arise when someone benefits from the system but contributes nothing in return. For many years, migration to Denmark was seen as a natural part of globalization. People arrived from the Middle East, Africa, or Asia, often fleeing war, poverty, or instability. The Danish state welcomed them with the belief that over time, they would integrate, learn the language, find work, and start contributing to the common system. But reality turned out to be far more complicated. Over the past 2 decades, the number of migrants from outside Europe has steadily increased, and it was no longer just about individual cases of war refugees. More and more people settled permanently, sometimes with entire families. Over time, it became clear that these people not only earned less, but also contributed significantly less to the common budget. The Danish government published a shocking report. Migrants from the Middle East and North Africa, along with their descendants, generate a net annual deficit of 24 billion kroner. This is money that, instead of supporting the system, burdens it. In comparison, native Danes have a positive fiscal contribution of over 40 billion. These differences are visible not only in tax statistics. Migrant incomes are on average 2 to 3 times lower than those of Danish-born citizens, and their savings, especially among older generations, are virtually non-existent. Worse still, the problem does not disappear in the second generation. Children of migrants also finish school less often, find jobs less often, and more frequently rely on social assistance. This is no longer just a matter of temporary adaptation. It's a signal that the integration model has failed, and its costs are growing each year.
Gå og fød flere børn, mand! Danskerne er 5 millioner, vi er snart udryddet, mand! Kig på danskerne, kig på nordmændene, kig på finnerne, mand! Vi er flere millioner, mand!
The Danish welfare system was built on trust, and that trust has its limits. More and more Danes began to feel they were being taken advantage of. A simple narrative began to take hold in public perception. Migrants come, use free healthcare, benefits, public housing, but give nothing in return. No work, no loyalty, no attempt at integration. Statistics only deepen the anger. 36% of migrant children in Denmark live in relative poverty. That is in households whose income does not exceed half the national median. In comparison, among native Danish children, that rate is only 2%. And as hundreds of social studies around the world show, poverty breeds frustration, and frustration can turn into violence. That's why the public debate began to focus not only on social costs, but also on real security risks. The media began asking, do we really want to end up like Sweden? And that question returned like a mantra. Denmark watches with concern what's happening in Sweden, where within a decade there has been a sharp rise in gangs, gun violence, and youth-related conflicts involving migrants. Danish politicians make it clear they want to avoid the Swedish scenario at all costs.
I don't want to be rude, but I also want to tell the truth how we discuss it in Denmark. And we always, when we debate immigration and justice politics, we always say we do not want Swedish conditions. We see that as the worst example.
Though Denmark and Sweden are only a short drive apart across the Øresund Bridge, today they are worlds apart on migration. For years, Sweden was the regional leader in openness, accepting more migrants than any other Nordic country. For a time, this was even considered a success of the Scandinavian model, but reality quickly corrected those assumptions. Over the past 10 years, Sweden has seen a dramatic rise in organized crime. These are no longer isolated incidents, but regular headlines in Swedish media. In Stockholm alone, the gun crime rate is now over 30 times higher than in London. It was a city once considered one of the safest in Europe. Denmark views all this with extreme caution and with lessons learned. That's why as early as 2019, the country began implementing tough measures not only to restrict migrant inflows, but also to regain control of neighborhoods with high concentrations of foreigners. For Denmark, Sweden became a negative model, a warning, and most importantly, unlike many other European countries, the Danes decided to act before it was too late. In Western Europe, migration is often like a grenade tossed into the heart of public debate. In France, it fuels endless protests and radicalization. In Germany, it creates deep divides between parties, some speaking of moral duty, others of existential threat. Denmark acts entirely differently. Here, migration doesn't divide the political stage. It's not a conflict between left and right. It's a cross-party consensus. The Social Democrats, who just decades ago were a symbol of openness and solidarity, now speak almost the same language as the center-right.
Tensions are increasing in Denmark as hordes of refugees continue pouring into the country. Migrants are arriving uninvited and refusing to adopt Danish customs.
Words that would be considered scandalous in most EU countries caused no uproar in Denmark because the opposition demands exactly the same. Fredriksen's government went down in history as the first to publicly declare an end to integration, replacing it with a policy of return. Surprisingly, society isn't deeply divided on the issue either. Danes, regardless of political leanings, largely support the current approach, not because they are against migrants, but because they want to protect a system that has worked for decades. They know that if the model collapses, it won't be politicians who suffer. It'll be ordinary people. In an age when Europe is dominated by emotions, chaos, and political gymnastics, Denmark stands out as an exception. Cool-headed, pragmatic, and surprisingly united. This is not Germany, not France, not Italy. It is a small country, relatively culturally uniform, well-organized, and crucially, with high social trust in institutions. This specificity allows it to act differently than the rest of Europe. In 2021, Denmark became the first EU country to start revoking refugee status from Syrians, claiming Damascus was now safe enough. Talks about human rights made little impression on Danish authorities. The course was clear: return and not integration. Today, Denmark is a leader in building a deportation model, which assumes that a refugee is only a temporary guest. And the goal is not to stay, but to return as soon as possible. Authorities openly declare that immigration policy has failed and that new solutions must be sought. One of them is so-called asylum outsourcing. The Danish government negotiated with Turkey, Albania, and like the UK, with Rwanda. The plan is to open asylum centers outside Europe so that those applying for protection don't come directly to Denmark. The idea is controversial, but for Danes, moral judgments matter less than keeping the system from collapsing. And most importantly, Denmark can do this legally. In 1992, after rejecting the Maastricht Treaty in a referendum, Denmark negotiated what's known as an opt-out, the right not to apply EU asylum rules. In practice, this means that as the only country in the EU, Denmark can ignore common migration laws and, for example, deport asylum seekers to partner countries outside the Union, which other nations cannot do without breaking the rules. Brussels may protest, criticize, but it has no tools to force Denmark to change course.
We would like to say to these people who are coming to Denmark that they should not calculate on staying in Denmark at all. We would like to refer these people to countries in the vicinity of the country where they fled. We're not interested in getting a whole lot of people who we supposed to...
Brussels may protest, criticize, but it has no tools to force Denmark to change course. As a result, Denmark is becoming an island, literally and symbolically surrounded by Europe, yet following its own path. Denmark didn't wait for the problem to spiral out of control. It didn't pretend that integration would eventually work. Instead, it responded firmly, concretely, and without regard for political correctness. And although not everyone likes it, it's hard to deny that Denmark simply managed. The model works because it is tough and clearly communicated.